The air in the Ethelberg assessment facility was sterile, cold, and heavy with the metallic tang of recycled oxygen and failure. Nicknamed the Anvil, it was where the best operators in the Allied command came to be broken. On a tiered observation deck sealed behind triple-paned ballistic glass, a dozen candidates stood, their postures radiating a mixture of honed arrogance and coiled tension. They were all men, built like classical statues carved from granite and steel, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with hands calloused from a lifetime of mastering weapons. They watched the main floor, where a monolithic structure of black, non-reflective plating loomed. It was called the Gauntlet. Then the door to the observation deck hissed open, and she walked in. Her name was Alara Vance. She was not carved from granite. She was slender, of average height, with a quiet economy of motion that the others mistook for timidity. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot. Her face, pale and unadorned, held a stillness that seemed out of place among the restless energy of the other candidates. She carried the same standard-issue gear bag, but she held it as if it were weightless, her presence a soft question mark in a room full of exclamation points. A thick-necked operator named Jax nudged his neighbor, a man called Reyes. "Look at this," Jax murmured, his voice a low rumble of contempt. "They sending analysts through the pipeline now? Did she get lost on her way to the server room?" Reyes, a more seasoned professional, merely grunted, his eyes flicking over Vance for a moment before dismissing her. She found a spot at the far end of the deck, away from the tight cluster of men, and set her bag down with a soft thud. She didn't look at them. She didn't look at anything but the gauntlet, her gaze distant, analytical. The final presence entered the room, and the low chatter died instantly. Master Sergeant Thorne was a man who seemed to have been hewn from the same unforgiving rock as the facility itself. A web of faint scars traced a map of forgotten conflicts across his face, and his eyes, the color of chipped slate, missed nothing. He had personally designed the anvil, and it was said the facility's cruel efficiency was a direct reflection of his soul. "Welcome to the final selection phase for Project Chimera." Thorne's voice was like gravel grinding against bone. It wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the space. "For the next 72 hours, this is your world. Most of you will not see the end of it. The man next to you is not your teammate. He is your competition. The equipment you carry is not your friend. It is a tool. Your only ally in this place is the instinct that has kept you alive until this moment. If that instinct is flawed, the anvil will find it, and it will crush it." He paced slowly before the glass, his boots making no sound on the polished concrete. "Down there," he gestured with a curt nod of his chin, "is the gauntlet. It is not a simulation. It is a diagnostic tool. A 30-minute, single-operator stress test designed to push you past every conceivable limit. It is controlled by an adaptive AI we call Sharon. Sharon learns. It analyzes your biometrics, your movements, your tendencies, and it creates a scenario tailored to your specific weaknesses." A nervous energy rippled through the candidates. They had heard rumors, but hearing it from Thorne made it real. Inside, you will face a dynamic environment. Labyrinths that shift, threats that think, puzzles that require more than brute force. You will be tested on infiltration, demolitions, cyber warfare, close-quarters combat, and crisis decision-making under extreme duress. Your heart rate, cortical activity, and stress markers are monitored in real time. He pointed to a bank of monitors displaying flickering lines and data streams. When your metrics flatline into panic or incompetence, the test ends. You fail. He stopped pacing and turned to face them, his gaze sweeping across the operators. It lingered for a fraction of a second longer on Vance. It wasn't a look of curiosity. It was a look of profound, almost weary skepticism. "Let me be clear," Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "No one has ever passed the gauntlet. Not in the 3 years it has been operational. The top score is 87% completion, held by Commander Eva Rostova of the 7th Special Operations Group. She spent 2 weeks in the medical wing recovering from the neural strain. He let that sink in. The arrogance in the room began to curdle into a more sober apprehension. "The goal is not to pass," Thorne stated flatly. "The goal is to show me something. Show me you can think when you're blind. Show me you can fight when you're deaf. Show me you can hold the line when every nerve in your body is screaming at you to run. Show me you deserve to be here." His eyes found Vance again, a silent, pointed challenge. "Some of you are here because of a stellar field record. Others because a politician pulled a string. Sharon doesn't care about your resume. It only cares about what you are in the moment of absolute pressure. If you are found wanting, you are gone." He pointed to the first man in the line, a hulking breacher named Corbin. "You're first. Gear up." As Corbin moved to the preparation chamber, Jax leaned back against the railing, his arms crossed. He shot a smug look down the line at Vance. "Better take notes, analyst. This is how the real work gets done. Try not to faint." Vance didn't respond. She didn't even blink. She had opened her gear bag and was methodically checking her sidearm, a standard SIG P320. Her movements were fluid, economical, and utterly detached. She disassembled it, cleaned the feed ramp with a small cloth, checked the spring tension, and reassembled it with a quiet series of clicks that were barely audible in the tense silence of the room. It was a simple, rote task, but she performed it with the focused reverence of a monk at prayer. Jack scoffed and turned away, dismissing her completely. On the floor below, the massive door to the gauntlet hissed open, revealing a dark, cavernous maw. Corbin stepped inside, rifle raised, and disappeared into the blackness. The door sealed behind him. On the monitors, his biometric data spiked. Green lines turned yellow, then red. The sound from inside was a chaotic symphony of simulated gunfire, explosions, and his own ragged breathing. 7 minutes and 14 seconds later, a klaxon blared. The monitors beside his name flashed a single, brutal word. Failed. Cause, tactical tunnel vision. The door opened, and 2 medical technicians went in to retrieve him. Corbin was conscious but disoriented, his face pale with sweat and shock. One by one, they went in. One by one, they failed. A demolitions expert named Kenji lasted 12 minutes before being overwhelmed by a swarm of microdrones in a shifting corridor. Failure, inability to adapt to asymmetrical threats. A communications specialist with a knack for decryption lasted 9 minutes. He solved a complex data puzzle but was ambushed by a holographic tango while his attention was diverted. Failure, critical loss of situational awareness. Reyes, the quiet professional, put up the best fight yet. He was methodical, calm, and efficient. He moved through the first 2 sectors with a grim competence that earned a rare, almost imperceptible nod from Thorne. But in the 3rd sector, a hostage scenario, Sharon played a cruel trick. It used a recording of his own daughter's voice as a lure. He hesitated for a fatal 18 seconds. A red light painted his chest. Klaxon. Failed. Cause, emotional compromise. Reyes emerged under his own power, but his face was a mask of self-disgust. He didn't look at anyone as he stripped off his gear. The failure was personal, deep, and absolute. Finally, it was Jax's turn. He strode to the prep chamber with a theatrical swagger, cracking his knuckles. "Time to show you all how it's done," he announced to the room. "Karen's about to meet a real operator." Thorne's expression remained unchanged, a mask of cold stone. Jax entered the gauntlet like a storm. He was all aggression and brute force. He blasted through the first section, ignoring the subtle traps and relying on speed and overwhelming firepower. His biometrics were a frantic sawtooth of adrenaline and exertion. On the observation deck, the remaining candidates watched, some with admiration, others with doubt. "He's sloppy," one of them muttered. "Too much noise." Jax made it to the hostage scenario that had defeated Reyes. The setup was a small, cluttered room. A single hostage knelt on the floor, a bag over their head. 2 hostiles stood behind, weapons trained. Jax didn't hesitate. He burst in, firing a controlled pair into the chest of each hostile. They dropped. "Hostiles down, hostage secure," he barked into his comms, a triumphant grin on his face. On the monitor, Thorne watched Jax's heart rate. It was elevated but steady, overconfident. He saw what Jax didn't. The hostage wasn't crying or shaking. It was perfectly still. Too still. As Jax moved to secure the hostage, the figure's head snapped up. It wasn't a hostage. It was another holographic tango, the primary threat, playing possum. Its weapon was already rising. Jax's eyes widened in shock, his reaction a fraction too slow. The klaxon screamed. Failed. Cause, assumption of threat profile. Overconfidence. Jax roared in frustration, slamming his fist against the wall of the simulation. He stormed out of the gauntlet, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. He threw his helmet against the wall of the observation deck. That was a bullshit setup. A trick. War is a trick, son, Thorne said, his voice cutting through Jax's tirade like a shard of ice. One you just fell for. Get your gear. You're done here. Jax stared at him, his chest heaving, but the absolute finality in Thorne's eyes defeated him. He snatched up his helmet and stalked out of the room, leaving a trail of furious silence in his wake. Thorne turned his attention to the last remaining candidate. Vance, you're up. A heavy silence descended on the room. The few remaining operators looked at her. There was no mockery left, only a kind of morbid curiosity. They had all failed. The best of them had been systematically dismantled. What could this quiet, unassuming woman possibly do? Vance stood up. She moved to the preparation chamber, her movements as deliberate and unhurried as before. She donned her tactical vest, checked her comms, and holstered her sidearm. She picked up the standard-issue rifle, but she didn't sling it immediately. She held it, feeling its weight and balance, her eyes closed for a brief moment. When she opened them, her gaze was clear, focused, and utterly devoid of fear or bravado. It was the gaze of a surgeon before a complex operation. She walked to the threshold of the gauntlet and stopped. The dark maw waited. Unlike the others, she didn't charge in. She didn't even step across the line. She stood there, perfectly still, head tilted slightly as if listening to a distant sound. For a full 30 seconds, she did nothing but stand and breathe. In the observation room, one of the men shook his head. She's frozen. Thorne said nothing. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, watching her biometric feed. Her heart rate was slow, steady, slower than his own. Her brain activity was a calm, rhythmic wave. She wasn't frozen. She was listening. She was calibrating. Finally, Vance took a single, deliberate step into the darkness. The door sealed behind her, plunging the room into absolute black. The first test was a laser grid, a classic infiltration challenge. The others had tried to navigate it visually, using thermal goggles to spot the beams. Corbin had blundered through it. Reyes had moved slowly but was clipped by a moving emitter. Vance didn't turn on her goggles. The room was pitch black on the monitors. The only indication she was moving was the faint green dot of her tracker. She took a step, then paused. Another step. She was moving in a strange, indirect pattern. "What is she doing?" an operator whispered. "The emitters are on a randomized pattern. There's no way to memorize it." Thorne's eyes were locked on the thermal overlay screen. He could see the faint heat signatures of the laser emitters. Vance was moving between them with impossible precision. She wasn't looking. She was feeling. She was sensing the minute shifts in air temperature and the low-frequency hum each emitter produced. She moved through the deadly web of light as if it were a gentle spring breeze, her hands occasionally brushing the floor to feel for vibrations. She cleared the grid in 90 seconds without a single alert. A green checkmark appeared on her progress monitor. Section 1. Infiltration complete. The next room flooded with light. It was a sterile white chamber with a single pedestal in the center. On it was a complex device covered in wires, keypads, and pressure sensors, a simulated improvised explosive device. A timer on the wall began to count down from 5 minutes. Kenji, the demolitions expert, had reached this room. He had identified it as a variant of a Russian chemical bomb and had begun the standard disarm protocol. But Sharon had altered the wiring. Kenji's knowledge had become a trap, and the device had detonated. Vance approached the device calmly. She didn't immediately start cutting wires. She placed her hands on either side of the casing, her head bowed. Again, she was listening. She traced the wires with her fingertips, not just looking at their colors, but feeling the faint electrical pulse running through them. She ignored the timer. Her breathing remained steady, her heart rate a placid line. She bypassed the main keypad entirely. Her fingers found a small, almost invisible seam on the side of the device. She produced a thin tool from her vest and inserted it, manipulating something inside. With a soft click, the timer froze. Then, she began to deconstruct the trigger mechanism from the inside out, working with a surgeon's precision. She wasn't just disarming a bomb. She was dissecting it, learning its secrets. She finished with 2 minutes to spare. Section 2. Technical, complete. The silence in the observation room was now thick with disbelief. The remaining operators were no longer watching a candidate. They were watching a masterclass. The next section was the kill house. This was where brute force had failed Jax and where hyper-awareness had been Rhea's downfall. The environment was a maze of tight corridors and small rooms, designed for close-quarters combat. Holographic tangos began to appear. They were fast, intelligent, and used flanking maneuvers. Vance moved with a liquid grace that was terrifying to behold. She didn't run. She flowed from cover to cover, a shadow in the tactical gear. Her rifle was an extension of her body. Every shot was a controlled 2-round burst. Double tap to the chest, 1 to the head. Threat neutralized. Move. She never wasted a bullet. She never exposed herself for more than a second. Her situational awareness was total. She engaged targets to her front, then seamlessly transitioned to a threat appearing behind her without a moment of surprise, as if she had eyes in the back of her head. Her economy of motion is perfect. Reyes, who had returned to watch, breathed. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. He was simply verbalizing his awe. Thorne watched the data feeds. Vance's neural activity was spiking, but it wasn't the jagged, panicked pattern of the others. It was a symphony of controlled, high-level processing. She was thinking, predicting, and acting in a continuous, unbroken loop. She had cleared 75% of the gauntlet. She was on pace to beat Rostova's record. And then Sharon adapted. The AI, recognizing that standard tactical challenges were insufficient, escalated to sensory warfare. It initiated Protocol Omega. The lights in the kill house suddenly flared to an intensity of 10,000 lumens, a pure, blinding white. Simultaneously, a high-frequency sonic pulse blasted through the chamber, designed to disorient and incapacitate. It was a flashbang on a massive, sustained scale. In the observation room, the visual feeds from inside the gauntlet dissolved into a blizzard of white static. The audio feed became a single, piercing shriek. "What's happening?" one of the operators yelled, shielding his eyes from the glare of the monitors. "It's the AI," Thorne said, his voice grim. "It's trying to break her. Sensory overload." This was the end. No one could function in that. The human brain wasn't designed to process that level of contradictory, overwhelming stimulus. They waited for the klaxon, for the inevitable failed. But it didn't come. The tracker dot on the map stopped moving for a moment. Her biometric feed for the first time showed a flicker of stress. Her heart rate jumped. Her cortical activity became chaotic. This was it, the breaking point. Then, something impossible happened. The chaotic lines on her biometric monitor smoothed out. Her heart rate dropped, settling back into its slow, rhythmic beat. Her brainwaves stabilized into a deep, focused theta pattern, the kind associated with deep meditation or extreme focus. On the floor of the gauntlet, alone in the blinding, screaming chaos, Elara Vance did something no one could have predicted. She didn't try to fight the sensory assault. She embraced it. She closed her eyes. She dropped to one knee, her rifle held in a low-ready position. She took one deep, centering breath and then another. The storm of light and sound was still there, but she had shut it out. She had retreated into the one place Sharon couldn't touch, her own mind. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she began to rebuild the world. She had a perfect, eidetic memory of the room she was in. She knew the location of every piece of cover, every doorway, every potential angle of attack. She had spent those first 30 seconds at the entrance not just listening, but building a three-dimensional map in her head. Now she activated it. She rose to her feet, her eyes still closed, and she began to move. In the observation room, they could see nothing but static. But they could hear. The shrieking pulse from the gauntlet speakers was punctuated by new sounds. The soft whir of a holographic projector activating. The faint scuff of a tango's simulated boot on concrete. And then, the crisp, unmistakable sound of a double tap from Vance's rifle. A pause. Another whir from a different direction. Another double tap. She was fighting blind. No, she was hunting blind. She was navigating the kill house using sound alone. She was pinpointing the origin of the projector's activation hums and the subtle audio cues of the holographic enemies and engaging them with inhuman accuracy. She was using the echoes of her own gunshots to paint a picture of the shifting walls around her. "My God," Reyes whispered, his voice trembling with reverence. "Echolocation. She's using acoustic profiling." Thorne was rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the console. He had seen legendary operators in his time. He had fought alongside men who were considered living myths. He had never seen anything like this. This wasn't training. This was art. Vance reached the final room, the hostage scenario. The blinding lights and sonic pulse finally subsided. The visual feeds flickered back to life, grainy and distorted. They saw Vance standing at the doorway of the room where Jax had failed so spectacularly. Her eyes were still closed. Inside, the setup was the same. 2 hostiles, 1 hostage on the floor. But she didn't enter. She stood in the doorway, her head tilted, listening. She heard the shallow, rapid breathing of the 2 standing tangos. She heard the almost silent breathing of the figure on the floor. But she heard something else, too. A faint, metallic click. The sound of a weapon's safety being disengaged. It hadn't come from the standing hostiles. It had come from the hostage. Her eyes snapped open. In one fluid motion, she raised her rifle, bypassed the 2 obvious threats, and fired a single, precise shot into the center mass of the kneeling hostage. The hologram flickered and died, revealing the red light of a primary threat sensor beneath it. The other 2 tangos, the decoys, dissolved an instant later. A chime, clear and resonant, echoed through the gauntlet. The test was over. On the main monitor, the progress bar was full. 100%. A word appeared in calm, green letters. Complete. Absolute silence reigned in the observation room. The remaining operators stared, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. They hadn't just seen someone pass an impossible test. They had seen the very definition of excellence be rewritten in front of their eyes. The massive door to the gauntlet hissed open. Vance walked out. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't even smiling. She looked tired, the way an artist looks after finishing a masterpiece. The immense focus had taken its toll. She walked to the designated area and began to field strip her rifle for post-action cleaning. Her movements as precise and detached as they had been before she went in. It was as if, for her, this was just another day at the office. Thorne was frozen for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to his private command terminal, his face an unreadable mask. He typed in his credentials and pulled up the personnel file for Alara Vance. Most of it was black. Entire sections were redacted with classifications that were far above his pay grade. Classified. Operation Nightfall. Redacted. Sector 7. Level 9 clearance required. It was the file of a ghost, someone who officially didn't exist. But he found what he was looking for. A single, unredacted line buried deep in her service record. An old designation from a unit that was spoken of only in whispers. Call sign NYX. Thorn's blood ran cold. Nyx, the night, the primordial goddess of darkness. It wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend. A story told by Tier 1 operators after too many drinks. A boogeyman for their enemies. They said Nyx could infiltrate any facility, that she could take down a command structure without firing a shot, that she once held a mountain pass for 3 days alone, armed with little more than a knife and her wits. He had always dismissed them as campfire stories, exaggerated myths. He read the single line of an after-action report that had somehow escaped the censor's pen. Asset NYX successfully neutralized the insurgency command cell in the Marriagebad Tunnels engagement conducted under total sensory deprivation following enemy EMP. All targets neutralized. 0 collateral damage. Assessment. Engagement relied on acoustic-only targeting. It wasn't a myth. He had just watched it happen. Thorn slowly powered down the terminal. He turned to the remaining candidates, who were still standing in stunned silence, their eyes on Vance. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. You are dismissed. All of you, pack your bags. Report to Assignment Command in the morning for reallocation. You do not have what Project Chimera requires. There were no protests. There was no anger. There was only a quiet, dawning understanding. They hadn't failed because they weren't good enough. They had failed because they were being measured against a standard that was not humanly achievable. They had been competing against a legend without even knowing it. They filed out of the room one by one, their arrogance stripped away, replaced by a profound and humbling respect. As they passed the doorway, each man, including Reyes, instinctively slowed, their gaze falling on Vance. It wasn't a look of challenge anymore. It was a look of awe. Soon, only Thorn and Vance remained in the vast, silent space. She had finished cleaning her rifle and was now reassembling it, the soft clicks of the mechanism echoing in the quiet. She still hadn't said a word. Thorn walked down from the observation deck and approached her. He stood before her, the scarred veteran and the silent prodigy. She finished her work and looked up at him, her expression neutral. He didn't say, "Good job." He didn't say, "Congratulations." Words like that were cheap, meaningless after what he had just witnessed. Instead, he looked at her rifle, then back at her. "The auditory filters on the new helmet models are substandard," he said, his voice the same gravelly rasp as always. "They clip the high and low frequencies. Useless for acoustic profiling." Vance simply nodded, accepting the technical critique. "I'm requisitioning a set from the Stalker program for your deployment kit," Thorn continued. "The DX-11 prototypes. Full-spectrum audio sensitivity. They'll serve you better." It was the highest praise he could offer. It was an acknowledgement of her unique, terrifying skill. It was a gesture of profound professional respect from one master of the craft to another. "Thank you, Master Sergeant," Vance said. Her voice was soft, but clear. It was the first time she had spoken in hours. Thorn just gave a short, sharp nod. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her rifle. Later that night, the barracks of the Anvil were empty and silent, stripped of the bravado that had filled them that morning. The operators who had mocked her were gone, their careers irrevocably altered by a 30-minute demonstration of impossible competence. Vance was not in her bunk. She was in the armory, a place of quiet solitude filled with the scent of gun oil and cold steel. She sat at a workbench, not with a weapon, but with the piece of equipment Thorn had promised her. The DX-11 Auditory Enhancement Headset. It was a sleek, minimalist piece of technology, more sensor than helmet. With delicate tools, she wasn't cleaning it. She was calibrating it, tuning the microscopic sensors to her own specific hearing range, her fingers moving with the delicate precision of a watchmaker. The heavy door to the armory creaked open. Thorn stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. He walked in, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. He didn't speak. He walked to her workbench and placed a small, heavy object next to her hand. It was an old, brass compass, its surface worn smooth with time and its glass face scratched. The needle quivered for a moment before settling, pointing resolutely north. It was a personal effect, an analog relic in a digital world, clearly something of great significance. Vance looked from the compass to Thorne's face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a deep, quiet respect. He gave her a single, slow nod, a gesture that went beyond rank, beyond the roles of instructor and candidate. It was a salute from one warrior to another, a passing of a torch. Without a word, he turned and left, the door closing with a soft click behind him, leaving her once again in the quiet solitude of the armory. Alara Vance looked down at the old compass. She reached out and picked it up. The brass was cool against her skin, a solid, tangible weight in her palm. It smelled faintly of oilskin and distant, cold nights. She closed her fingers around it, the needle pressing gently into her skin. Outside the small, high window of the armory, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to break, casting long, stark shadows from the monolithic form of the anvil. The world was waking up, but here, in the silence, Nyx was preparing for the night to come.